everyone. Welcome to the fifth episode of Climate Voyage podcast series, where we talk about the link between climate change and biodiversity. I'm Rasana Nandasena, and this podcast is conducted aligning with British Council Youth Climate Ambassador Program 2023. Our main collaborators are British Council Sri Lanka, Global Youth Biodiversity Network Sri Lankan Chapter, and Earth Lanka. Today's episode is about climate change, biodiversity, and sustainability. The guest speaker for today's episode is Minuri Perera. Minuri Perera is graduated from the University of Colombo with a degree in economics, and currently she works as a research professional at Center of Poverty Analysis. She is the climate advocate at British Council Youth Climate Ambassador Program 2023. So join me in welcoming Minuri Perera. Hi, Minuri.
Sarah, thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, it's nice to have you as well. So let's dive in. So to initiate the discussion, can you provide us with a brief overview on the current state of climate change in Sri Lanka and what impact it has caused on environment and our community?
So we know climate change is a global phenomenon. Globally, ambient temperatures have been rising. It has been on the rise. However, the impacts have been felt more profoundly by developing countries like Sri Lanka. So even in Sri Lanka, we know that ambient temperatures have been rising. Each year has been hotter than the year that preceded it. Our hottest year recorded was 2016. But at the end of this year, this year was also a terribly warm year. So we will see whether this year has been the winning year in terms of temperature rise at the end of the year. So what it means is what temperature rises mean for Sri Lanka and other developing countries is that because we are developing countries, we are particularly vulnerable to effects of climate change on account of several things. Firstly, it's exposure. Because of our locality, we are located so close to the Bay of Bengal. Because of our locality, we are exposed to climate stressors and climate hazards more so than other countries. And also our adaptive capacity, which is very low. Financially, technology-wise, our adaptive capacity is quite low. And especially right now, against the backdrop of a very severe economic crisis, it's unlikely that our growth path, our growth trajectory will be focused on anything but economic recovery. So we will not be looking at environmental damages or prevention of environmental damages, prevention of climatic stresses, particularly because we are in such a bad shape, such a bad situation financially. So because of these things, we are even more vulnerable to climate change. So the idea is that against such a backdrop, we will resort to a growth path that is not going to be very conducive for sustainable development. If anything, it will be re-geared towards economic growth only. And when we focus on economic growth, we will then resort to a growth path that will severely undermine the environment. When that happens, it will come at the cost of our forests, it will come at the cost of our natural resources. When that happens, our capacity of the natural resource base to sequester carbon declines further. And when our temperatures are on the rise again, then its effects and consequences will be felt even more so in the coming years. So how these effects manifest are in different ways. So we have rapid onset events and also slow onset events. Rapid onset climate stresses are stresses that happen very suddenly within a very short span of time. For example, like floods, cyclones, and even the heat waves that we have been experiencing in the past few months. So when these are actually consequences of ambient temperature rises. But in addition to that, there are also slow onset events in Sri Lanka. For example, ocean acidification, which will then compromise our coral health, saltwater intrusion, land and forest degradation. These are slow onset events that have been taking place over a given period of time, over a longer period of time. So these are very critical. I mean, despite whether they're rapid or slow onset events, these are very critical and common issues. But however, something we also need to focus on is that despite the common issues and despite us being a very tiny island country, the degree to which it affects different localities, different communities, it differs. So when we target interventions to address these climatic issues, we need to take into account these differences, particularly when we look at these localities and communities in terms of who's depending on natural resources. That's when we can identify where climate change is severely affecting who, and how we can who's made more vulnerable and who needs more support. So I hope that covers a very small and a brief overview of how climate change is impacting Sri Lanka.
I just want to know, how does biodiversity conservation connect with climate change and sustainable development? So if you can please share some examples or initiatives that highlights these interlinkages as well.
Yeah, great question. But first, we must unpack what sustainable development really is. So by definition, sustainable development is development that does not compromise resource availability for future generations. So it takes into account three domains. It takes into account the society, the people, the environment, and also profits, economy. So the three prongs are society, environment, and economy. But what we see is that particularly in countries like Sri Lanka, where the idea of sustainable has not been very internalized by people, what we see is that the domains of society and environment are then undermined in pursuit of profits. So we see that our forests are cut for timber, our forests are cleared to build hotels, our natural resource bases are depleted in pursuit of forests, for example, fisheries, both by people with high power and people with low power. So what then really happens in countries like Sri Lanka is that we are focusing only on one domain, which is the economy. When you focus solely on the economy, which then forgets society and environment, that kind of a development is not sustainable. So your question was, how does biodiversity conservation connect with climate change and sustainable development? So climate change and biodiversity, two different concepts that come together, that merge, that converge at one point. So for climate change, which is a systemic issue, the difference between climate change and biodiversity, it really lies on the degree to which the two concepts are interconnected to a larger physical system. So when we take climate change, it doesn't matter where you are emitting greenhouse gases from, it affects everybody. It doesn't matter that Sri Lanka is emitting very low greenhouse gases. We are very much affected by climate change. So we can hold other countries, we can hold developed countries that really developed on fossil fuels, that are now talking about, oh, we have to be sustainable, but no, their growth was very much on natural resources. So we can hold these countries accountable. But when it comes to biodiversity, it's our own doing that is depleting the biodiversity and natural resource base. We can't hold anyone else accountable for that. So what really happened, how climate change and biodiversity conservation really converge is when us, because loss of biodiversity is very much our own doing now. So when we deplete our natural resources, for example, our forests, our oceans, our wetlands, our mangroves, when we deplete these resources in pursuit of economic gains, then we are losing a very critical part of our ecosystems. These are key drivers of carbon sequestration. They're very important to keep the environments cool. They're very important carbon sinks. So when we deplete them, what then would happen to the future resource availability? What would happen to future generations? So again, I was talking about how sustainable development is a three-pronged approach, how economic gains undermine social gains. But when social gains are undermined, people can take to the streets. People can really protest. We've seen that happen. When their lives, when their livelihoods, when their social fabric, when they're threatened, people do take to the streets. But when the environment is affected, when our forests are cut, when our wetlands, our mangroves, our other carbon sinks, when they're affected, other species don't really have the same luxury that we have of protesting and taking to the streets. It's really just a small percentage of people with that stake, like environmentalists, people like us, you and I. It's us who talk about it, right? But then it really doesn't have the same luxury that the environmental domain doesn't have the same luxury that the other two domains have. So which is why it is really important going forward when we talk about sustainable development to really integrate environmental concerns into it. So you also asked me about examples or initiatives that take into account these interlinkages. So a lot of projects, especially foreign donor-funded projects, for example, the Global Environmental Facility Small Grants Project, they actually do take into account these nuances. So, but again, the problem is that these are small grant projects. They're very small in terms of its impact, very small in terms of its quantum. So although within these limitations, they do take these interlinkages into account. A lot of donor-funded programs, like EU-funded programs, BHC-funded programs, they have their requirements that really then looks into achieving coherence between sustainability, like coherence between economy, society, and the environment. However, how much of an impact it makes at a national scale is to be questioned. So if you take the private sector, a lot of private sector companies now have CSR projects, corporate social responsibility projects. They also look into achieving these interlinkages. But then with the private sector, we also need to be cognizant of the fact that this is not just corporate greenwashing, and that they're actually doing something for the society, for the economy, and the environment as well.
As an environmental activist and a researcher, what are the key challenges you have encountered in promoting sustainable development practices in Sri Lanka?
Again, it is really that it hasn't, like I said before, the concept of sustainable development has not been internalized by people. So when they look at development, I think development has also very largely been misconstrued as growth, economic growth, but these are very two different concepts. So it is really that lack of awareness about what entails sustainable development, that you can't undermine society, you can't undermine the environment in pursuit of economic gains. That is actually something that hasn't been, that people aren't very cognizant of. So there needs to be a lot of interventions on that ground for capacity building, for awareness training, sensitizing about how we should take development forward. Because even, I've seen people on, like social media platforms arguing about this very fact about economic growth versus sustainable development. And the idea with the general public, the idea that lies with the general public rather, is that what should have a bigger focus now is economic growth and not sustainable development. Because like I said, we are now trying to recover from a very severe economic recession. So right now, the idea, the understanding is that we need to come out of this somehow. And coming out of this somehow would mean that we will come out of it at the cost of the environment and, very vulnerable communities also that are mostly natural resource dependent. So really, to promoting sustainable development, the biggest challenges that there is that people aren't very cognizant of what is sustainable development. That is the problem. And honestly, like when taking public transport, I've seen people, throw like plastic bags, PET bottles. These are conversations we've been having for a very long time now. to be honest, like as a person, I really don't know how much more is there to be done, how much more is there to be told to these people, like, do not throw PET bottles away, because it creates a waste problem. When there's a waste problem, it emits more greenhouse gases. When it emits more greenhouse gases, ambient temperatures rise, and when ambient temperatures rise, the causes and the consequences manifest in more than one way. So really, it's really insensitizing, but I also do not know how much more sensitization there is to be done. So maybe a lot of actors, the government, the media, maybe all of these, the private sector, donors, maybe we all need to come together to get these conversations forward, to internalize the idea of sustainable development, to ingrain it into people's minds.
Are there any specific research projects and or initiatives that you are currently working on that highlights this interlinkage?
So currently at work, this is not something that I do personally, but at work we are trying to do a project that is funded by, again, the British High Commission, that look into how climate change acts as a threat multiplier when it comes to acts as a threat multiplier. So what we are really looking at is how in climate stress, in areas where climate stresses are present, for example, in areas that are drought affected, how when water availability goes down, how it would lead to conflicts and disputes among parties that are diverse. Like it can be ethnic diversity, religious diversity, like where multiple identities exist, how climate change can act as a threat multiplier. We are looking into it. This is a consortium between International Water Management Institute, Chrysalis, and SEPA. So again, this is not something I do personally. Right now, we are doing the groundwork for it. And in the next 2 years, we will come up with an intervention that would address not only climate change, but climate change-driven conflict.
So thank you for sharing the input. In your opinion, what are some of the key policy priorities for the Sri Lankan government in terms of climate change, sustainable development, and economic growth? And also, how can these areas be effectively integrated to national strategy?
Very good question. Extremely good question. Also, because we always talk about how interventions should be bottom up and not top down, while acknowledging that interventions should be participatory and inclusive as much as possible. I also think the most impact can be made at national level, which is extremely hard, but that is where change needs to start. That is where change needs to be implemented, designed. For example, so recently we did a project in partnership with Stockholm Environment Institute on how coherence in decision making and decision implementing can lead to reducing inequalities. So what we found out through that project is that in Sri Lanka, decision making is extremely siloed. There is absolutely no communication, coordination between state departments, state agencies, which leads to very isolated policymaking. So when policies are made in such silos, for example, let's take agriculture as a whole, right? So when it comes to agriculture, there are so many institutes that need to come together for decision making, for policy designing. Irrigation has to come together, environment has to come together, agriculture has to come together. But what we see is that when it comes to designing policies for irrigation, for agriculture, for environment, they do not happen in the same room. Often they don't come together when these policies are designed. They're very much made in very isolated bubbles. So when you make decisions in isolated bubbles, and it's only a very few people who come together to make these decisions. So A, isolated bubbles. B, that a very limited number of technocrats that are coming together. So when that happens, the impact that it can make is very little. And it also leads to disputes, because irrigation and agriculture would then get into fights about how their policies are in disagreement. So what really should happen? What are the policy priorities for Sri Lanka is to actually make policies that are coherent. Bring everyone that should have a seat at the table together, talk these things out and make decisions that are coherent, so that it would lead to reduced inequalities, that it would lead to better outcomes. And when decisions are being designed, when policies are formulated, when policies are implemented, bring the people together as well. Participatory policy making is crucial. But what we see is that, when it comes to agriculture, farmers never have a say, extension officers never have a say. It's people that are at the top, a few people that are at the top, technocrats, really, who are only, complacent in their subject areas, that are making these decisions. They don't really take into account what kind of an impact it would happen on it would have on the society, what kind of an impact it would have on anything other than their subject area. These conversations are not taken into account. So really, coherent policy making, coordination between government agencies, and participatory decision making are key priority areas for the Sri Lankan government, not only in terms of climate action, sustainable development, and economic growth, really in everything. So health, environment, agriculture, disaster risk management. So all of these, coherent, coordinated policy making is what is really needed. So very recently, last week, in fact, we had a workshop with a lot of government agencies, government representatives. So going forward, we hope the knowledge that we produce will be, taken into account by government agencies in their policy design and policy implementation. So, we can be hopeful, but really it lies in how much our work has also been internalized by these external, state parties.
So thank you, Minuri. So your group is currently working on making this coherence or collaboration that you mentioned before. So can you propose any innovative methods or strategies that you can propose as a young advocate to initiate this collaboration?
Yeah, so this is about youth empowerment, right? So youth empowerment really is a huge part of climate action. So we have ACE, Action for Climate Empowerment, that really focuses mostly on youth empowerment. So we know that climate change was really accelerated. Like, in addition to natural climate variability, the anthropogenic part of climate change was really, accelerated by the generations that preceded us. It is their mistake, the consequences of their mistakes that we are now suffering from. So we know some of these consequences have been irreconcilable and, even irreversible in a sense. So it's the youth that can really ensure that our generation do not repeat the same mistakes that the previous generations did, so that we can leave something for the future generations, the generations that are yet to come. So yes, youth empowerment is a critical part of climate action. So how we as youth can really hold the government accountable is through collective action. So you and I as individuals will not be able to do that, but collectively we are a huge force. We do have more power than we give ourselves credit for. So it is really through collective action and advocacy that we can really push the governments to make the right decisions. I think British Council's YCA program and British Council's other programs, they are really equipping us and readying us to take on this task of, collective power and advocating for right change by pushing the government, other external parties, other parties like the private sector, for example. So it is really through collective action that the youth can really make a change. And, if anything, by make a change, I also mean it is by pushing for coherent decision making between the government, private sector, NGOs. So it is really through collective action that we can do that.
You already explained what the role of youth in this climate action, sustainable development, and economic growth in Sri Lanka. Do you have anything to add to the role that young people have in this scenario, that means climate change, sustainable development, and economic growth? So you have worked in the field for few years now. So do you have any message to give to our young generation? Something like that.
Yeah. So we also see that mostly in other countries, particularly developed countries, we see a lot of youth action, but we also need to be cognizant of the fact that these developed countries developed on the backs of our resources. They developed on fossil fuel, so they do have the luxury of, taking the right path of action, I suppose. While Sri Lanka may not have the same luxury, while developed countries, the global south, may not have the same luxury, I think our youth also need to be a little bit more sensitized towards this issue. We can't really ignore climate change, and a lot of youth in Sri Lanka do not acknowledge climate change with the same passion as youth from other countries. It's the fact that the climate is changing is very obvious. We've had a crazy heat wave in the past few months, and then it started raining pretty severely all of a sudden. But still, the youth isn't cognizant of the fact that there is a connection between these climatic stresses and our own activities. So maybe my key takeaway message to the youth would be: read up, learn about climate change. Don't think that it's a crazy conspiracy theory, because it's very much not. And do your part. At least stop frequently using single-use plastics. You don't really need to buy water every time you go out if you have a water bottle like this, maybe. You can make these very little habitual changes that can create a massive impact. Like I said, if we make these changes collectively, the impact will be huge. It's not like you and I using a reusable water bottle every day. If all of us used reusable water bottles every day, what kind of an impact can it make in terms of waste generation? So learn about it and do your part, do your duty, is what I would say to the youth.
So before winding up the discussion, Minuri, do you have something to add to our discussion? Do you have to provide inputs on an area that we have not highlighted here?
I think we covered a lot of ground, and I'm really happy and proud that you're taking this action forward. It's really great, because knowledge creation, knowledge dissemination are also, key facets of climate action. So I'm very proud of you, and I'm very happy for you, and I wish you all the very best with your podcast series going forward.
So thank you very much for joining with us and sharing your input. So you created a very great perspective to our podcast. So thank you very much, Mary. So this marks the end of fifth episode of Climate Voyage podcast series. So let's meet again in a new episode. Until then, take care.